Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, it gives me a great pleasure to be able to welcome you today to the first event in the academic series of the Center of Yoga Studies organized here at SOAS. I'm welcoming you today in my capacity as chair of the Center for Yoga Studies, and I will be with you throughout the year with various academic events, seminars, conferences, book launches that we have organized for the 2025-2026 season. At SOAS in the center, we pride ourselves bringing together expertise from different fields of yoga studies, ranging from the historical to the contemporary, ranging to many countries across Asia, India, of course, but also to other countries, China, Tibet, and so forth. The links of yoga reach beyond boundaries, know no boundaries, and very often we encounter developments in one country that we then also witness elsewhere and vice versa. And with this in mind a little bit, it gives me a particular pleasure to be able to welcome today my old friend and colleague, Professor Giacomella Orofino from the University of Naples. Professor Orofino is a scholar that doesn't call for much introduction. She has dazzled us for many years now with her studies on the Kala Chakra Tantra and its different exegetical traditions, and has in many ways played a key role in putting that field of study on the map. Today, however, we will learn on a topic that sits a little bit outside the Kala Chakra, and that is we will learn about about Tibetan interests, Tibetan treatises, or at least treatises composed in Tibetan about physical yoga, about the traditions that eventually led to the formulation of the haṭhayoga system and its future developments. So with this topic, of course, Professor Orofino has touched on a very important nerve in recent haṭhayoga studies that began to reveal more and more connections to the Tibetan tradition at different levels, and her publication lays bare or introduces one of those perhaps most important antecedent in Tibet. So without much ado, I wish to invite Professor Orofino to introduce to her today's book launch, her principal findings, and to ask then, followed by Jason Birch's contribution as a respondent. Thank you so much for both of you, and please, Giacomella, kick off.
Thank you, Yurik, for your very nice introduction, and thank you, Jackie, for organizing this event, and thank you, Jason, for being respondent. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today. So my book, shall I share the text? My book presents an edition and translation of a Tibetan text closely connected to the Amṛtasiddhi, which is a Sanskrit Vajrayana manual of yoga teaching that literally means the attainment of immortality. The Tibetan text I worked on, the title of this text is the Chimeki Transel in Tibetan, and in Sanskrit its equivalent is Amṛtasankata, which translates as Dispelling the Hindrances to Immortality. It's a yoga manual that outlines 36 dynamic physical trainings, each divided into 3 phases, preliminary, main, and concluding. And taken together, this amounts to 101 108 distinct physical exercises, referred to as yantra in Sanskrit and churkor in Tibetan, all aimed at removing obstacles to the realization of supreme wisdom and immortality for the Amṛtasiddhi. I first got the idea of study these texts when I came across earlier academic studies on the Amṛtasiddhi, in particular the 2021 edition and translation by Jim Mallinson and Peter Santo of the Sanskrit text of the Amṛtasiddhi, and the Amṛtasiddhi Mula, a related text preserved in the Tanjore, which survives only in Tibetan and is not extant in Sanskrit. Their research places the Amṛtasiddhi within a Buddhist tantric context and attributes its composition to a figure named Madhavachandra, who was active in the Deccan region of India no later than the 11th century. Although few Indian sources document the history of the Amṛtasiddhi, the Tibetan canon preserves a corpus of more than 25 texts which associated with this teaching. And the Amrita Sankata Nivarana is the first, the text translated here in this text in my work, is the first in this collection. Its colophon names the compiler as the mahāsiddha Yogeśvara Amoghavajra, while also consistently linking the transmission of the tradition to the legendary figure of Virūpa. As is often the case with Vajrayana material, issues of authorship and transmission remain complex. Nonetheless, Virūpa, also known as Virūpaksha, clearly emerges as a central figure in the dissemination of the Amṛtasiddhi yoga tradition and Virūpa and the transition of Nat Shaivism. According to Tibetan hagiographic tradition, Virūpa was born in East India and later moved to Deccan and southern regions. This narrative is supported by James Mallinson 2019 research, which draws on non-Buddhist literature, inscription, and medieval statuary to trace Virūpa's presence in the southern Konkan, a region that from the 11th century onward witnessed a peaceful transition from Vajrayana Buddhism to Nat Shaivism. This shift is also reflected in the Lila Charitra, a 13th century Marathi hagiography, which recounts how Gorakshnatha converted Virūpaksha from the Buddhist Vajrayana lineage to the Shaiva Amroli lineage, after which he became known as Adandinatha. From this period onward, non-Buddhist sources increasingly include Virūpaksha among the siddhas of the Shaiva Nat tradition. Virūpa's conversion during his travel in southern Konkan not only exemplifies this religion's transformation, but also sheds light on how the yoga techniques described in the Amṛtasiddhi began to circulate outside their original tantric Buddhist context. These techniques, initially developed within a Buddhist tantric framework, were later assimilated into the Nat tradition, where they had a significant and lasting influence on later Shaiva yoga literature. Alongside Virūpa, also known, as we have seen, Virūpaksha, and Madhavachandra or Avaduta Chandra, the colophon of several treatises related to the Amṛtasiddhi in the Tibetan canon also mentions other yogins. Two main transmission lineages emerge from these sources. One is associated with Enadeva and the other with Amoghavajra. Both appear to be active in Tibet from the late 11th century to the early 12th century. Enadeva is credited with translating the Amṛtasiddhi Mula, that Peter Santo translated in his publication of the Amṛtasiddhi, and several other texts. According to one colophon, he was originally from Magadha and made 3 journeys to Tibet. Remarkably, he completed the translation entirely on his own, without the assistance of a Tibetan Lotsawa, a striking exception to the standard practice in which Sanskrit Tibetan translations were typically produced collaboratively by an Indian Pandita and a Tibetan translator. He is most likely the same individual later referred in Tibetan sources as Kala Virūpa, or the Black Virūpa, who is described as a direct disciple of Virūpa. Amoghavajra, known in Tibetan as Donyon Dorje or Vajrasana the Younger, is associated with more than 20 texts related to the Amṛtasiddhi preserved in the Tanjore. However, he is listed as the translator in only one of them. He is the translator. This text is the Amṛtasiddhi itself, where the colophon likewise notes that just as Enadeva, the Black Virūpa, he completed the translation independently without the aid of Tibetan Lotsawa for the other texts that are connected with the Amṛtasiddhi in the Tanjore, but are authored by Amoghavajra. In the remaining texts, Amoghavajra is identified as either the author or compiler, Yige Gopa in Tibetan, indicating that once in Tibet, he began composition new works directly in Tibetan, and he thus emerged as not only as a transmitter of Indian tantric knowledge, but also as an interpreter and reformulator of the Amṛtasiddhi teachings for a Tibetan audience. This new Tibetan literature played a vital role in the development of transmission of Buddhist teachings during a pivotal moment of cultural exchanges in the 11th and 12th century, before the consolidation of Tibetan scholastic traditions. Translation effort that began under the Tibetan monarchy reached a peak during his period, ultimately leading to the formation of the Kanjur and the Tanjore canons. Amoghavajra's contribution exemplify how these endeavors went beyond translations. Rooted in Sanskrit sources but composed in Tibetan and tailored to local culture, his works represent a dynamic phase of literary innovations, just as tantric Buddhism was declining in India due to the rise of Hindu dominance. Now let's see what is haṭhayoga in Vajrayana. This method, which literally means yoga of force, first appeared in Indian Sanskrit literature during the later centuries of the first millennium. From its origin, it followed multiple trajectories, evolving across various religious traditions and schools, and its widespread popularity, especially from the 19th century onwards, is a relative recent development. As noted in 2011 by Jason Birch, the first texts to describe haṭhayoga were Buddhist tantras. In fact, the method is absent from early Shaiva tantras and only appears later in the texts such as the Rudra Yamalottara Tantra. So the earliest attested mention of haṭhayoga is found in the 8th century Buddhist Guhya Samaja Tantra, specifically in verse 161-163, in three verses of chapter 18, that is the Guhya Samajottara Tantra. There we are told that if a practitioner of Shadanga Yoga fails to achieve visionary experiences, darshana, leading to realization, and after 3 attempts of 6 months each, they must resort to haṭhayoga, or forceful approach, forceful yoga, Tobkinajor in Tibetan, that brings awakening and the perfection of knowledge. Although the reference to Hatha Yoga in the Guhya Samaja Tantra is brief, a much fuller account appears in the 11th century Sri Kalachakra, Laghu Kalachakra, and its commentary, the Vimalapraga by Pundarika. There, Hatha Yoga is presented as a supplementary technique to be used when the primary method of Shadanga Yoga fails to produce the desired visionary experiences. One of the most clear explanations of this method is found in Naropa's Paramartha Sangraka, where he cites the Kalachakra Tantra directly. When the immutable moment Aksharakshana does not arise due to the faulty breath control, the practitioners apply forceful techniques to channel prana into the avaduti, into the central channel. In this process, prana, conceived as a fiery feminine energy, rises from the navel as a red flame, melting the lunar bindu located at the crown, represented by a white hum syllable. And the resulting nectar then descends through the chakras, producing 4 successive states of bliss, Ananda. At the climax of the practice, the yogin encounters the Vishvamata, or the Universal Mother, who bestows 5 forms of supernormal knowledge. The early form of Hatha Yoga, as described in the Kalachakra tradition, is primarily a subtle breath-based method, distinct from the postural and dynamic practices that characterize later Shaiva Hatha Yoga systems. It is intended, this original Buddhist method, Hatha Yoga method, is intended as a corrective or supplementary method within the broader process of an interiorization Buddhist tantric practice known as Utpanna Krama, to be used when the practitioner is unable to control vital energies, prana and apana, through standard meditative method. So is an auxiliary method used in the Utpanna Krama phase of the practice of the Tantra, the Zorim in Tibetan. So it belongs to that phase, to the Utpanna or Sampanna Krama phase. What distinguishes is the intensity with which the energies are directed into the central channel, allowing the practitioner to stabilize the bodhicitta bindu and enter higher states of realization. So according to the alchemical doctrine of the Amṛtasiddhi, the body is a microcosm, perfectly symmetrical with the macrocosm. At its center lies the avaduti, referred to as the goddess of the center, Madhya, corresponding to Mount Meru, the cosmic axis of the universe. At the summit of the central channel is the moon, source of the nectar of immortality, and at its base is the sun, which rises upward to consume that nectar. Their inner union is likened to an eclipse, symbolizes liberation. Verses 1.8 of the Amṛtasiddhis offers the earliest known definition of yoga as the union of sun and moon. And however, the text does not yet use the term Hatha Yoga, nor it associates the sun and the moon with the syllables ha and ta, a symbolic interpretation that emerged only in later Shaiva traditions. This link between yogic and alchemical models is further underscored by the terminology used in the Amṛtasiddhi. Its core techniques are called Mahamudra, Mahabandha, and Mahaveda. that mirror the sequence Mudra, Bandha, and Veda found in the Lagu Kalachakra Tantra, where the ritual union with the consort, Mudra, leads to the binding of bodhicitta, Bandha, which in turn allows the body to be pierced or transmuted, Veda. This reflects a symbolic system of inner transformation modeled on alchemical processes aimed at the realization of Sahajananda. In the Amṛtasiddhi as well, the essential goal of the three mudras, this Mahamudra, Mahabandha, and Mahaveda, is to direct the breath into the central channel to attain liberation, and this same principle underlies the central method described in Amrita Sankata Nibbana. Here the practitioner forcefully unites prana and apana by channeling the breath into the central nadi and retaining at the navel chakra. This is achieved by drawing apana upward and pressing prana downward, both with great force. So as its title suggests, the text functions as a preparatory manual of physical exercises through core, designed to remove hindrances and ready to the yogi for the central practice of the Amṛtasiddhi. Although the Amrita Sankata Nibbana does not explicitly name the three canonical mudra, Mahamudra, Mahabandha, and Mahaveda, it contains clear references to similar techniques. Structured in 36 chapters, it functions as a manual of physical yantra intended to remove obstacles within the body, the Buddhist Vajrayana path. Now let's see the word yantra. The Sanskrit term yantra appears twice in the Sanskrit text of the Amṛtasiddhi, both in chapter 11 in connection with Mahamudra. So in chapter 11:5, it refers specifically to breath control training, and chapter 11:10, it more broadly denotes yogic training. This is quite important because this is a yoga text in Sanskrit where the term yantra is used in the sense of breath control training. In later Tibetan Buddhist tantric literature, yantra and its Tibetan equivalent chulkor, literally machine or device, came to refer more generally to dynamic physical practices. The term frequently appears in the compound tsa lun chulkor, which are the channels and the prana and the movement, the physical dynamic postures. The tsa lun chulkor are practices connected with the sampanakrama, with the Zorim phase of the tantric practice. We have to notice that a variant spelling chulkor, written in another way with the pa rather than the ka, is also attested, likely reflecting an orthographic variation rather than a shift in meaning. Some modern authors translate chulkor as magical movement because chul could mean magical, maya, trulpa. But in my view, this rendering, while evocative, does not accurately reflect the term's original meaning. Interestingly, in the Chinese translation of Drapa Gyaltsen text on the 32 chulkor, there is a Chinese translation of this very early 13th century text by a Tibetan Shampakajupa master. This translation is rendered in Chinese luan lun, which means confused, like trull, could be also confusion. So literally they translated it confused will, but it is the term yantra. And in my opinion, this is an idea that I have. Since the Amṛtasiddhi presents a teaching structurally grounded in alchemical principles, the term yantra may also be understood in its technical alchemical sense, as referring to the sealed crucibles used in Indian alchemical literature. These vessels were designed to contain volatile substances and apply controlled heat to induce transformation, specifically transformation of gold, of mercury into gold. So you see, these are all the name and the form of the crucibles in Indian alchemy. They are all called Buddha, Rajatantra, Damaru Yantra. So it could be possible that this term yantra, in a text that is definitely a alchemical text like the Amṛtasiddhi, and later also in Tibetan, the turquoise were intended for a transformation. We could say a yogic transformation of the reality of also the elements of the yogin could be connected with these crucibles of the alchemy, of the Indian alchemy. So in this metaphor, the yogic body, through posture, breath retention, and internal locks, function as an alchemical device for inner transmutation. Interestingly, some of physical yoga poses described in the Amrita Sankata Nibbana, or the Chimetru Chansel, closely resembles asana found in later Indian haṭhayoga literature, making this one of the earliest known manuals to document dynamic postures using vigorous yoga method, or haṭhayoga, top Ginajor in Tibetan. These unnamed postures, presented with remarkable precision, align with asanas that were later codified in Indian texts and became central to both pre-modern and modern yoga traditions. Several of these poses have been able to identify in later Indian sources, and I have indicated their correspondence chapter in the Amrita Sankata Nibbana, while distinguishing between those established in the medieval pre-modern period and those that appear prominently in modern yoga system. And now I have to acknowledge the great help that Jason Birch gave to me while I was working on this text, helping me in recognizing the turquoise with the asana that we have in pre-modern and modern yoga system. Among these poses, we have poses identified as medieval pre-modern asana. We find Padmasana, of course, explicitly named in Tibetan Peme Giltrung, and referred into the Gorakshataka as a foundational seated posture. But we have also in chapter 3, the first position is Kukutasana, one of the non-seated postures. And now you can see how we have in the text is really a manual of yoga. So I say adjust the feet in the Vajra cross-legged posture, clench the fists, put them inside the cross-legged posture, press the ground with strength, bring the weight on the hands, lift the cross-legged posture in the air. So it's amazing. This is a late 11th century text, Tibetan text, that says exactly this. It looks like a modern manual of yoga. And other dynamic poses we have Trivikramasana, Shalabhasana appear in the Hatha Padata, in other Granda Samhita, in other later texts, and other notable medial postures include Duryodhanasana, Kapali asana, trivikramāsana. So it is also inverted postures. So I don't think I have too much time. So I go quickly to my conclusion. You see, we have this. I reported the translation of the text, like in the 21st chapter, we have this description of Kapaliyasana with strength, place the palms of the hands and the head on ground, bring the legs together, raise them up in the air. And so I put some tradition, like this is very interesting. This is a very famous climbing up a tree, stay firmly with the head downward and embrace the tree with the legs and hands, and as if grabbing onto a lap, slightly pull the apana and forcefully pressing down the prana, practice with great strength. So this, presumably, this is the first time that it was written in Tibetan, but this is the first time that this pose is described in literature. So I think I jump a little bit, so I leave this to the readers. So the Amrita, we could say that in sum, the Amrita Sankata Nibbana presents a rich corpus of physical practices that rank among the earliest documented examples of dynamic yoga. Together with other texts in the Amṛtasiddhi's corpus attributed to Amoghavajra and preserved in the Tibetan canon, it marks a pivotal moment in the transmission and transformation of Amṛtasiddhi teaching from the second half of the 11th century. As we have seen, the Amṛtasiddhi was originally composed in the Deccan region of India, within a Buddhist tantric context. From there, its teaching appeared to have diverged along two distinct trajectories. On the one hand, a Buddhist trajectory crossed the Himalayas and through figures such as Enadeva and Amoghavajra reached Tibet, where the tradition continued to evolve within Vajrayana Buddhism. On the other hand, a Shaiva trajectory can be observed in the incorporation of the Amṛtasiddhi verses into Shaiva haṭhayoga texts from the 12th to the 15th century, though without explicit attribution. The earliest Shaiva texts showing this influence in the Amaroga, a shorter recension of the Amaroga Prabodha attributed to Gorakshnath and later used by Svamaratma, that Jason Birch has worked on and translated in composing the Pradipika, that is the foundational manual of 15th century of Shaiva Hatha Yoga. So in recent research, Jason Birch has proposed a compelling hypothesis. Both the Amṛtasiddhi and the Amaroga may have drawn from a common earlier Buddhist source, with the Amaroga's Hatha Yoga section perhaps preserving a version closer to the original. This possibility invites us to rethink the intertextual relationship between Buddhist and Shaiva Hatha Yoga tradition, revealing a more entangled and reciprocal dynamic than previously recognized. Ultimately, the divergence into Buddhist and Shaiva branches mirrors the broader historical trajectory of Indian Buddhism itself. While Buddhism gradually declined and disappeared in the Indian subcontinent, it found continuity and transformation in Tibet, especially Vajrayana Buddhism disappeared and found its continuity and transformation in Tibet. And as recent research has shown, the history of Hatha Yoga is far more complex than previously assumed. The material preserved in Tibetan canon suggests that the Tantric Buddhism may offer some of the earliest documented formulation of physical yoga practices, predating the Shaiva counterparts. These findings invite us to reconsider the early development of physical yoga not as the domain of a single tradition, but as shared terrain shaped by intersecting Buddhist and Shaiva lineages, each contributing to its evolution over the centuries to come. Thank you for attention.
Thank you, Giacomella, for this really interesting introduction to your work. It gives me great pleasure now to invite Jason Birch. Jason, hello, to articulate a few thoughts about Giacomella has so admirably put together. Jason.
Thank you, Ulrich. Well, I'm delighted to see the publication of The Dawn of Physical Yoga, Dispelling the Hindrances to Immortality by Professor Giacomella Orofino. This book is indispensable, not only for historians of Tibetan yoga and religion, but also scholars of Indian yoga, as I will discuss tonight. In many ways, it's the perfect sequel to the haṭhayoga project's research on the Amṛtasiddhi and Amṛtyoga. I dare say my colleagues on that project were hopeful that our publications would result in further research on Tibetan literature related to the Amṛtasiddhi. The Dawn of Physical Yoga has done exactly that, and in my opinion has produced stunning results on the basis of solid philological research. In a nutshell, as Giacomella explained, this book presents a critical edition and annotated translation of a Tibetan manual known in Sanskrit as the Amṛta Nibbāna. Dating to the 12th century, it describes a sophisticated postural practice that was supposed to prepare a yogi for the mudra practice of the Amṛtasiddhi. The introduction of the book addresses the key questions raised by any pre-modern work. Who wrote it? When did they do so? And how does it fit into the broader history and literature of the time? The introduction has 4 sections. The first deals with the question of authorship. It covers the Tibetan account of Virūpa, the Indian siddha to whom the author of the Amṛtasiddhi pays homage. Enadeva, the central figure in the Tibetan transmission of the Amṛtasiddhi, who translated the Amṛtasiddhi Mula, among other works. Yogeśvara Amoghavajra, the author of the Amṛta Nibbāna, and Vanaratna, a renowned Indian pundit of the 15th century who translated Tibetan oral teachings of the Amṛtasiddhi back into Sanskrit. The next 2 sections clarify the use of the term haṭhayoga in Vajrayana and outline the central teachings of the Amṛtasiddhi. Giacomella tonight has given you a broader taste of those sections. The 4th section focuses on the Amṛta Nibbāna itself. Apart from its association with the Amṛtasiddhi, this text strikes me as a remarkable work on physical yoga for 3 reasons. Firstly, within the history of Trulkor, the Tibetan word for exercise, which is equivalent to yantra in Sanskrit, it appears to be a relatively early work, possibly contemporary with a 12th century illustrated manuscript at the Imperial Treasury of the Palace Museum Library in Beijing. Giacomella discusses this in footnote 40 on page 27. I mention it just so that the reader doesn't skip over the footnotes. Many of the footnotes contain valuable and interesting information. This manuscript depicts 32 Trulkor sequences in 117 images, whereas the Amṛta Nibbāna describes 36 sequences of 108 exercises. Secondly, although it does not designate the practice as haṭhayoga, it uses the equivalent Tibetan word for hatha more than 100 times, often in regards to a forceful physical movement or forcefully uniting prana and apana. And finally, as Giacomella states in her book, some of the physical yoga poses described in the Amṛta Nibbāna closely resemble asanas found in later Indian haṭhayoga literature, making this one of the earliest known manuals to document dynamic postures using a vigorous yoga method. End of quote. The introduction also discusses some of the Tibetan postures that resemble those of later Indian yoga traditions, as well as 36 hindrances that these yantras are said to destroy. As a historian of Indian yoga, I'm most fascinated by the section that follows, where Giacomella examines how the Buddhist and Shaiva traditions of physical yoga diverged after the Amṛtasiddhi. While Buddhism declined in India but flourished in Tibet, the Amṛtasiddhi teachings became highly esoteric in Tibet up to the 19th century. She writes, quote, although the Amṛtasiddhi teachings did not achieve the same widespread diffusion as parallel yoga traditions, such as the 6 yogas of Naropa, they nonetheless had a significant impact in Tibet. The Tibetans collected and elaborated on teachings related to Buddhist haṭhayoga, cultivating a rich body of physical yoga instructions. These practices, as demonstrated by manuals such as the one translated in this book, emerged contemporaneously with, or perhaps even earlier than, the corresponding Indian literature. End of quote. On the Indian side, the Amṛtasiddhi's mudra practice and 4 stages of yoga appeared in a more rudimentary form in a Shaiva work known as the Amṛtasiddhi, which perhaps preserves an older account. This text classified these practices as haṭhayoga. They were later integrated into the Hatha Pradipika in its teachings on mudra and a form of meditation known as Nada Anusandhana, in which the yogi focuses on the internal resonances that arise during the practice. The divergence between Indian and Tibetan Hatha Yoga traditions from the 12th century onward is a key question raised by this research. Central to the answer are notions of asana, mudra, and yantra. In India, the term yantra, in the sense of a physical exercise, was not adopted in the yoga traditions that followed the Amṛtasiddhi. And I would also add that a lot of the alchemical metaphors and terminology that Giacomella spoke of earlier also seemed not to make much traction in yoga texts after the 12th century. Early non-Buddhist Hatha Yoga featured a physical practice consisting mainly of bodily seals, mudras, which include the application of internal muscular locks, bandhas, during breath retentions. The few asanas mentioned in early Hatha Yoga texts are seated, stationary postures. The use of full body mudras, sometimes known as karanas, and internal muscular locks called bandhas distinguishes hatha from earlier forms of yoga. The earliest surviving account of these 3 mudras and 2 bandhas appears in the Amṛtasiddhi. Apart from tightening the anus during mantra recitation, these practices are largely absent from first millennium traditions of Shaivism, where the term mudra more generally denotes a hand gesture. The few exceptions prove the rule. For example, a chapter in the 4th Shatka of the Jayadratayamala describes several karana, some of which manipulate internal energies, but none resemble hatha yogic mudras. Likewise, the Matanga Parameshvara Tantra uses the term karana to describe the specific positioning of body parts that renders an asana fit for yoga, an idea that was not expressed in later hatha works. Given the scant evidence for hatha yogic mudras in early Shaivism, it seems likely that they arose in India at the beginning of the 2nd millennium on the back of a long tradition of breath practices known as pranayama. Current research indicates that this innovation may have occurred within a Vajrayana milieu. However, we should bear in mind that there is nothing inherently Buddhist about the Amṛtasiddhi's physical practice. Its descriptions of the practice are largely free of Buddhist theory, unlike passages that explain its benefits and soteriological role. The Amṛtasiddhi does not teach the three mudras of the Amṛtasiddhi, though it does mention tapping Mount Meru, which figures in the Amṛtasiddhi's account of its third mudra, Mahaveda. It seems to me that these two works are linked more closely by a shared sectarian tradition than by content. Since the Amṛtasiddhi may not be a translation of a Sanskrit work, but rather a codification of oral teachings for a Tibetan audience, one might ask whether the Amṛtasiddhi's mudras and the Tibetan yantras originated in different milieus before their association in Tibet. A question I would like to pose to Giacomella is whether there is evidence for these yantras in Indian Vajrayana traditions, since I know of no equivalent in Shaivism or Indian yoga. As her book shows, some physical postures of the yantras resemble asanas that were first documented in later Indian yoga traditions. Despite the many centuries between these sources, the comparison raises many questions, including the possibility of a shared source or even influence between these traditions. Outside of yoga, physical practices have been poorly documented in India. We know little about the history of exercise, vyayama, mentioned in early Ayurvedic sources, the details of practicing tapasya, or the techniques and training regimes of martial arts and wrestling. Given that a dynamic, sophisticated postural practice was documented in 12th century Tibet, we must remain open to the possibility that similar practices existed in India but were not recorded. Most of the Indian textual sources that Giacomella cites for parallel postures date to the 17th or 18th century, suggesting that somehow these yantras may have evolved into and entered yoga traditions of the early modern period. On the balance of probabilities, this seems unlikely to me. The earliest available hatha texts indicate that physical practice in the form of mudras was used to manipulate internal energies and raise kundalini rather than asanas or yantras. Forceful manipulation of the main vital winds, prana and apana, is a salient feature of the Tibetan yantras and, as is well known, the haṭhayogic mudras too. For example, by pressing the heel against the anus in the practice of Mula Bandha, the yogi forcefully contracts apana and pushes it upwards. This process is also mentioned in haṭhayogic accounts of Padmasana and Siddhasana, where either Mula Bandha or some sort of pranayama is involved. And rather than yantras, when preparatory practices for hatha are mentioned, they are typically mantra and laya yoga. It is only in the 15th century that some non-seated postures were adopted through the revisionist and pioneering work of the Hatha Pradipika's author Svatmarama. This suggests that although yogis may have been practicing such asanas before the 15th century, as seen for example in sculptures on the 13th century Mahudi Gate, they were not formally codified or perhaps even considered integral to Hatha Yoga until later. In short, although cultural exchange between India and Tibet is well documented, I suspect their traditions of physical practice evolved along distinct lines. In India, early Hatha Yoga developed a mudra practice to manipulate internal energies, and only later, in the early modern period, incorporated non-seated asanas, mainly, it seems, for their health benefits. These developments appear to be unique to the Indian tradition. In Tibet, Trul core practices dating back to the 12th century combined postures, including inversions, with manipulating prana and apana to remove hindrances and prepare yogis for the mudra practice of the Amṛtasiddhi. Whether the postural practice of yantras merged with or evolved into a dynamic postural practice of asanas is something I would like to know from Tibetologists. Giacomella's book has undoubtedly furthered our understanding of the Amṛtasiddhi's impact in Tibet and provides a valuable insight into how its mudra practice was combined with a set of preliminary physical exercises called yantras that in some ways anticipated postural practice in later Indian yoga traditions. Thank you very much.
Jason, thank you so much for those very thoughtful observations and comments on Giacomella's book. And Giacomella, there were a couple of things that Jason flagged up, and are you ready to say something about those points?
Yes. Okay. So
Please proceed. Please proceed.
Yes. I think thank you very much, Jason, for reading the text and for your very insightful comments. So you raised several questions, and let's start from the last question. When you say that the Tibetan Trulkhor dating to the 12th century, including inversions and manipulating pranayapana, they prepare yogin for the mudra practice, but not only for the practice of the Amṛtasiddhi. We have after the 11th century, and so in the 12th century, in the 13th century, so very early in Tibet, we have many texts about Trulkhor, and these are about yantra, and they are connected to, as I say, to the practice of the Utpanakrama of the Tantra. So they are connected with the Tantric tradition. Even in the Bonpo tradition, they have a Tantric system. They are later, but they also have this Trulkhor. So Trulkhor are really essential for increasing the inner heat and the practices that are very famous, like the 6 yogas of Naropa, the Tummo, one of these 6 yogas. The Trulkhor are important to develop, to increase the knowledge of these inner channels and practice of the tantric, not only of the Amṛtasiddhi. Actually, the Amṛtasiddhi is not very well known in Tibetan, and only in the Shampaka Jupa, in the Jonampa tradition, they know this tantra, but the other tradition, like in the Guhya Samaja, like the Kalashaka Tantra, etc., they developed other transmission of Trulkhor connected with the practice. And the question you say, this postural yantra evolved into the postural practice of asana, like in India. This never happened in Tibet. We have the Tibetan translation of the word asana is duktang, which is posture. Like we have Bhadrasana is translated like Sampo Duktang, but this is just the translation of the term that actually means posture. But we don't in Tibetan there is not a development of the asana like in the Shaiva tradition, on the later modern Shaiva tradition, pre-modern and modern tradition. But there are many transmission of Trulkhor. I don't know if I answer. If this.
Yeah, so it seems perhaps, would you say, coincidental then that we see some of the postures in earlier yantras, this yantra practice, Trulkhor, becoming asana, or being so similar to asanas in early modern yoga traditions.
So this is our mystery. This is the problem.
Well, I think it's fascinating.
I don't know.
Thing
I don't know. What I found is quite amazing. I mean, they had already in 11th century. They had this kind of postures. They called them true core, but they are very similar to the Indian asana.
Some of them, yes, some of them
Some of
certainly.
them, of course.
I also, I mean, I'm sure, but well, perhaps you can direct myself and many of the viewers to, I'd like to see a reconstruction or more illustrations of the Trul core. But from what I've seen so far, it strikes me that a lot of it is sort of done seated with different arm movements and so forth, and that are, as it's clear in the text you translate, that are supposed to manipulate internal energies. And that sort of seated practice I haven't seen so much in yoga literature. But in the sculptures of the Mahudi Gate, which has roughly maybe 80 or 84 asanas depicted, we see more of these type of seated poses. So I think that some of the non-seated poses that you refer to, such as Kukutasana, and Kukutasana, by the way, does have a very early history compared to a lot of the other asanas dating back to perhaps the 12th century. In India, we have Vaishnava sources, funnily enough, describing Kukutasana, and there's also temple iconography that's quite early depicting ascetics practicing Kukutasana. Do you think that the non-seated poses that we see in Trul core are, perhaps sort of less prevalent than the seated practice itself, with the different arm movements and so forth?
Oh, it's not really like this. There are many seated postures. Like all the let's think to the 6 yogas of Naropa, or the 6 yogas of Niguna. These are relatively early, and we don't know. We don't have a Sanskrit text of those instructions, but so we don't know exactly where they written down. But they are seated postures. They are manipulating of the prana, of the chakra, and with all the so they are seated postures. These trukora are a kind of auxiliary methods to increase and to develop those seated postures. And all those practices are very secret practices, like linked to the practice of the upanakrama, so the last phase of the tantric meditation, let's say. There is the upatikrama, the upanakrama. So the upanakrama is the second phase, and in the second phase of almost all the tantras, the Niruttara tantras, there are practices connected with the Tsalung core, developed by various Tibetan masters and teachers throughout all the literature from the 12th, 13th century. In the Nima tradition, they also think they are precedent, but we don't have early textual evidence of those, like connected with the Guyagarbha Tantra, etc. So in all the traditions we have in Tibet, we can see that there are these true core practices linked to the tantric practice, to the practice of the tantras.
So the Trul core in the text you translated, the Amṛtasiddhi, is that still practiced today in any form? Have you
Yes,
seen?
yes. Not the one. No, I've been looking for some living expert of the Amṛtasiddhi. I haven't found, but in the Champaka-Jupa, it seems that in the Champaka-Jupa they still have this practice. So I never met, but could be, because it is a living tradition. Like there is a Kalu Rinpoche that is teaching Trul core, but I never met him, so I would like to ask him if he knows this, if he practices this Amṛtasiddhi. But there are many texts, like in the Theravada also commented on the Amṛtasiddhi, and of course the earlier expert of the Shampagatupa tradition they have. But also in the like in the Sakya tradition they have different, not connected with the Amṛtasiddhi, but they have practices of the Tsalung Trulkhor. In all the tradition they have, in all the schools.
Well, I mean, I suppose, one thing we see today in modern yoga, and I think it's also very apparent in pre-modern yoga, is that physical practices evolve over time, and there's numerous variations in the sequence of asanas and the way that they're performed. So I'm just curious to know, well, I'd be curious to know that whether you think the text that you've translated preserves perhaps a different or an early version of these physical exercises that have changed over the centuries into perhaps different sequences with some new postures or exercises added, and whether it's possible at all to sort of trace any such developments through the history, or
I think definitely, yes. I think it's possible to trace. I mean, I started just with the first text that is found in the Tenjur, but in the corpus of many other Tibetan authors, I think we find there are so many texts, even Puton wrote about Tsalung Trulkhor, many, very different tantric authors wrote about their explanation of the Trulkhor practices.
So how do you think it changed since the 12th century, Trulkhor? What changes do you see?
Now, what I see is not that the Trulkhor practice is very secret, and the Tibetan don't teach this practice openly, and they don't. It's considered a very secret method, and they don't give so easily to students that want to do yoga like hatha yoga we do in the West nowadays. No, this is considered a very secret method connected to the development of the tantric practice. There are, of course, some masters that openly teach this Trulkhor, like Nanke Norbu has been teaching a form connected to his tradition of this yantra yoga. And in the Bonpo tradition, they also teach a lot of Trulkhor of the Bonpo traditions, and also in the Kaju, etc. They do teach, but on the basis of initiation. They must be initiated. They must follow the practice. They must go in retreat. There are many yogis in retreat also nowadays in Tibet. I know there are many yogis in Bhutan working in practicing in secluded places these kind of tantric, very secret practices.
So clearly a very rich field, clearly a lot more work to be done. Giacomella, Jason, I also wanted to thank you so much for that very lively, very helpful exchange. I thought maybe, Jackie, at this point it would be helpful to bring in our audience into the conversation. If you perhaps have a look at the chat, are there questions lining up?
There are. So perhaps we can start with a question that relates to Mallinson and Santos's publication of the Amṛtasiddhi. The question says, their publication suggests that the Amṛtasiddhi's physical yoga were directed toward a celibate yogi, i.e. the practices were of a non-sexual nature. And this is a sharp contrast to the yogini tantric cycles and their exegesis. So The question is, can you please elucidate and pinpoint the evidence from the Amṛtasiddhi that its practices were directed towards a celibate practitioner?
This question is for me or for
Yes, for you. Yes, Giacomella, yourself. Yes, please. Yeah.
I would like to concentrate in a short, in a nutshell. It's a complicated question. Yeah. So I don't know exactly if the Amṛtasiddhi is really for celibate yogi. First of all, in the sense that it is for what do they Malice and Santo mean for celibate? Because celibate means yogin who are not monk but lay people, if it is connected with the possibility of being a lay practitioner, not in a monastery or in a monastery, but the problem is more connected to the fact that it is celibate when the semen is not emitted. So what is very important, I mean, the fact that it is for celibate or not celibate, the point of divergence is, and this is important in all the tantras, in the Buddhist tantras and in the Shaiva tantras, that the semen must not be emitted. But this is not because they are not celibate, they don't have, they are not householders. It's because that is considered a mistake, an error. There are many, like in the Kalachakra Tantra also, they say the yogin must be a celibate, the highest master is the one who is celibate, who is a monk, and doesn't emit the semen, because the emission is considered an error, a mistake in the practice.
Yes, and a hindrance in a way. Jason, did you want to respond at all to that, or are you happy to move to the next question?
I would just add that, well, in my opinion, in the early Shaiva texts that follow the Amṛtasiddhi, I don't think semen retention is so important, but there's certainly the idea that one has to move semen up through the central channel persists, and it really, it's in the 15th century that Bindu Dharana, holding Dharana, and later becomes a much more salient theme in yoga texts.
Thank you. We have another question, again to Giacomella, from Marco, who says he'd like to ask how this work relates to the Virūpa text of oral transmissions of the Sun and Moon Yantra Yoga of Professor Norbu, which is much later.
The question is it this much later? Actually, no.
Sorry, how does it relate? Yes,
Yeah.
and does it relate at all?
Okay, it's very interesting that Nanke Norbu speaks about this transmission of a text that is called Nidaka-jor, which is the union of sun and moon. And we see that also Nidaka-jor is a haṭhayoga, also in the later interpretation of the Shaiva, is considered the union of sun, but also in the Amṛtasiddhi. Amṛtasiddhi is the first place. I mean, if we have to see some connections, one connection is that in the Amṛtasiddhi, they say that yoga must be done like the practice is the union of sun and moon. It is written in the Amṛtasiddhi, and in this text is called Nidaka-jor. But the text that Nanke Norbu taught actually we don't know exactly what is we cannot date it. I mean, I've not been able to precisely date it. It must be very late, very early. It is transmitted in the Nima tradition. From an emic point of view, it was taught by Vairochana, who was a master that arrived to Tibet in the 8th century. He received from a yogin, like from Virūpa, that is called Hunkara. But then we don't have textual evidence for of texts in those days. Also because the Niruttara Tantra, these texts are connected with the Niruttara Tantra, which are later, like the Laghu Kala Chakra Tantra is 11th century, beginning of the 11th century, end of 10th century. Even the Guhya Samaja is a little bit later. So we don't have evidence from an ethic point of view. I cannot say.
Well, thank you. And we have lots of questions, so I'll continue with the ones that are in the chat. There's another one from James Russell. So thank you very much, Professor, for your fascinating presentation. And I look forward to reading the book. And you gave some examples of yantras found in the Dispelling of the Hindrances of Immortality that resemble asanas found in later Shaiva Hatha Yoga works. And the question is, I'm curious if it also contains specialist pranayama techniques resembling those found in later Hatha Yoga works.
In this text, in this Chime Chancel, we have only one breathing, one pranayama technique, which is this prana and apana, like forcing down the prana and pulling up the apana. This is the only practice, I mean, pranayama practice that they teach in that text. But in other Turkor, we have a lot of many practices which are quite similar to those of the Shaiva traditions, like the Kumbhaka, etc., etc.
Quite distinct. Okay, but that's where this, I guess, the sophistication in the Shaiva Hatha tradition evolves a lot. It's those number of pranayamas, the number of shatkamas, the number of mudras, etc. But let's continue. There's lots of questions. There's another one here. An anonymous attendee has said, I only know Trulkor in its modern, non-secret shape that they've learnt from YouTube, which might differ from the older forms. This is mainly a seated practice, which includes lots of arm movements, also intense high jumps into a cross-legged position. And so the question is, are these practices found in your text?
In my text, I think yes, there are some practice that you have to move the arm, you have to jump, you have to do this, which is called bep in Tibetan. There are some bep which are connected with the Chandali practice, the Tummo practice in other tradition. So yes, there are so many Trulkor. So I don't know what he is referring to. I don't know what kind of Trulkor is it talking about. But as I said, after the 11th century, there was a flourishing tradition of Trulkor all over Tibet, in all the schools.
Yes, thank you. Another question for Giacomella. So why do you think the Tibetan practitioners turned the static yantra diagrams of Indian yoga and alchemy into physical practices? What does this change tell us about how they viewed the body's role in reaching enlightenment?
But the word yantra in Sanskrit is a polysemous. He has many meanings. So I don't know if it refers to the tantric, to the diagram. I thought it was more the alchemical pot, no? The alchemical apparatus that is called also yantra. More that rather than the diagram. But these are all.
Jason, do you have a
What is
do you have an
interesting is
opinion on
that in the Amṛtasiddhi they use yantra. They use yantra twice, saying, meaning physical training. So when I started to work to try to understand what are the yantra in Tibetan, I thought that the name was Trulkor in Tibetan, was original in Tibetan, and then was retranslated in Sanskrit as yantra. That was my idea. While now I'm sure that it was used at least in the Amṛtasiddhi, in Sanskrit, meaning breathing, training. So it is attested in Sanskrit and was translated in Tibetan, but then it was developed.
Well, I was interested in the alchemical sort of meanings and metaphors that you mentioned on the Tibetan side, and did they persist in Tibetan yoga? Because, as I've said in some of my publications, the alchemical metaphors that we see in the Amṛtasiddhi were not reproduced so much in later yoga texts, and when they were, often the meaning of them wasn't understood. So some of the technical terminology we see that being reinterpreted to sort of try and make sense of it in more recent commentaries. So was it the case that this alchemical terminology that we see with yantra, mahamudra, mahabandha, mahaveda, did that persist in Tibet?
No. It's quite interesting. We don't have Mahamudra, yes, but with a completely different meaning. It's the ultimate state of the tantric practice in the Niruttara Tantra, no? And Mahabandha, yes, bandha we have this the holding. There are many kinds of holding. Veda is translated as a wikpa in Tibetan, and I don't have much experience of this word, which is translated in the Amṛtasiddhi. It is kept in the Amṛtasiddhi tradition, but perhaps I haven't read enough literature to tell, but it's not very common.
Thank you. This is interesting. I think the alchemy side, this internal dynamics, is you see flavors of it continue, don't you, into later traditions, but it certainly doesn't maintain its clarity. So another question that's come through, and this one is to both Giacomello and Jason. Do you think that the human curiosity is enhanced with proclaiming that some teachings are secret and esoteric, and that perhaps led to misuse by certain teachers?
I cannot read the text, so I didn't understand very well. I cannot hear very well.
I'm sorry. I hope you can hear better. This one is from Joseph P. You can look at the questions in the chat window, but it says, "Do you think?" I'll read it again. Do you think that human curiosity is enhanced with proclaiming that some teachings are secret and esoteric? And does this lead perhaps to the misuse by certain teachers?
I don't know. It is really in the tradition it is considered secret. I mean, secret in the sense that the student, before getting these teachings, have to do a very long training, like 3 years retreat, etc., get the initiation. So it's not because they want to raise the curiosity, it's just the way it is, the tradition in Tibet.
Do you think that this is the result, or this results in the quite distinct lines of transmission, if you like, because we see within India that this opening up of the teachings to all people, householders, people of different sectarian traditions, and so the practices, the physical practices, as well as the breathing practices, seem to move across sectarian lines throughout India as more mobile techniques rather than remaining secret.
Yeah, actually, this is a phenomenon that happened also in Tibet. They decided. I talked to many Tibetan masters who said, no, we prefer to open, because otherwise these teachings will be destroyed. Nobody will know anything about it, and so they prefer to be more open nowadays. Even the Dalai Lama, for instance, he gives this initiation of the Kala Chakra. He has been giving initiation of Kala Chakra also for so long, because he said it's better to open this secrecy. So yes, but not.
Did you have any? Yeah, did you have any comments, Jason, on the?
Excuse me. What did you say?
No, I think the point you made, Jackie, was what I would have said. So.
Okay, and then we're coming close to the end. We've probably got about 8 minutes left. Let me just see. I'll scroll through some questions there. Lots of thanks to both of you for this wonderful presentation and also your arduous work on the book. And a lot of people are looking forward to reading the book. And there is a question about, is the book available open access, or must it be purchased? So that's a good question.
No, it will be open access, but after 1 year. So
1 year, and I can drop the link.
It seems that it's quite sold out, so I was thinking that maybe they could open access more, maybe sooner. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a very important work, and so it's exciting to hear that it's sold out already. I'll drop the link when we release the recording. I'll let people know where to purchase, but also in the future, perhaps in 1 year's time, we can make people aware of the open access. Let me just see if there's anything else. Someone asked about the redactor of your text. Did they know about Amṛtasiddhi's details? Does it quote the Amṛtasiddhi? I think it's asking. Are there any exegesis on this text? Sorry, the question's not so clear, but
sorry, which question is this? I can read it.
It's
because I cannot hear you.
5. Oh, sorry.
It's Sauraditya Banerjee's question. Giacomella, did the redactor of the Amṛta Nirbahana know about the Amṛtasiddhi in detail to the extent that he quotes it? Is there any exegesis on this text?
Yeah, there is another text by Amoghavajra, that is a commentary to the Amṛtasiddhi. It's a very complex text and very long text that I think I would like to translate in the future. So yes, there are more than 21 texts authored by Amoghavajra that I think needs to be read and understood. And they are connected with the Amṛtasiddhi. Not very easy to understand, but they are very connected. Yes, in some of the footnotes, I used the commentary to the Amṛtasiddhi by Amoghavajra, which is really very, very helpful. I repeat it. It's difficult to read it. It's written because I think he was an Indian who wrote in Tibetan, so sometimes it's quite difficult to understand the meaning.
Yeah, so is it rudimentary Tibetan, or what is it about the structure of the language that makes it challenging for you to translate?
It's very essential. It's very concise. And so it's not easy. It's not very well formulated. Mm.
And do you get a feeling that he was authoring this text from his own ideas, or was he attempting to author like lectures that he was listening to, or practices that he was observing? Do you get a feeling for what he was doing? Was he transmitting something that he had seen in India, perhaps, and then taking the knowledge? Or yeah, it's a really interesting period to try to see into.
Yeah, it seems like a very practical teaching, like instruction. So it's an instruction. He gives instruction, very detailed physical instruction of how to move the body, the arms, the legs, and everything. And it's out of maybe some of his experiencing, if we can say this word. Yeah, it was transmitting his own way of practicing.
And as we know, this is very difficult to write, to explain in a clear way. And often the conciseness of the instruction means there's a lot of room for interpretation within, in attempting to understand how these physical movements are done. So thank you very much indeed, Professor Orofino and Dr. Jason Birch. It's been a pleasure to host you both at the SOAS Center of Yoga Studies. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and so important, actually. So I feel really privileged that we've been able to host this discussion and to allow people to hear directly from you about your work. So we look forward to the publication being more widely available. So I'll send people the link, those that have registered. This conversation will be available on our platform to view afterwards. So for many people have asked if they can watch it again because they found it so informative. So thank you very much. We will be seeing Professor Orofino in Naples at the end of the year. So there's another opportunity to hear her speak about this research in Naples. So if you're in Italy, we can let you know about the dates there.
You will be online.
So thank you all very much. Also, wonderful, excellent. So it will be also online, wonderful. So thank you both very much for your time and for your extraordinary research. It's really fascinating and important.
Thank you very much.